All right, I think I am live. 30 viewers. Let me get the chat working, and then I will begin my talk. Hello, everyone. There is the chat. Oh, oh, it's like showing me ads. All right, this chat thing is annoying. See if I can get the chat room without these stupid Justin TV ads. All right, this ad is over. Oh, I do not want to hear my own live channel. Okay. All right, I think I have the chat window up. I do. Okay. Chat window up and working. And I think I am ready. I'm going to be looking in some weird direction because of how I'm orienting my camera in order to have my slides up. But hey, slides are working, so that's good. So I'll probably look like weird and creepy and inhuman, like because I'm not looking at you, and so it's not like we're two monkeys looking at each other and having a great conversation. But really, I am human. I'm not crazy. Um, so I'm going to talk about seasteading, making free societies by building them in the ocean. But really, I'm going to talk about more about the theory of freedom and how to get it, which touches deeply on issues of agorism. Some of the arguments that I make sort of on seasteading for libertarians on uh, changes to affect the structure rather than like trying to run for office or vote for politicians. I think many of these arguments are also directly arguments for agorism, but there's also some important differences, which I'll touch on at the end in some new material about some of the reasons why I think that frontierism is superior to agorism on current territory within current systems. Um, so I'll be giving first kind of the basic pitch, which hopefully this audience will agree with, although libertarians are sometimes like, oh my God, you're telling me that everything I do is wrong, ridiculous, and won't work. But hey, if that's true, better to know it. And then I will talk about what aspects of agorism I think are wrong and ridiculous and won't work because, in every crowd, I like to tell people they're wrong because that's fun and that's how we move forward. All right, so my goal is to convince those of you who don't yet look at activism mainly as a sort of structural matter of changing incentives to do so, and to get those of you who do think about activism that way to think about floating cities as a reasonable method for changing incentives. So I'd like to contrast what I see as sort of the old libertarian view, contrast two approaches to activism. The first one I call folk activism. It's based on an intuition we have that sees politics as the process of changing minds and building coalitions in small tribes. Nowadays, it finds expression in trying to win the war of ideas in academia, DC, the media, trying to elect candidates, publishing policy papers, showing that the laws we pass don't achieve the goals that they claim to achieve, and lots of other things that are completely hopeless and won't do anything. The new way is what some people call structural activism, where we view bad laws as emergent behaviors of flawed political systems, and then in my own sort of addition to this, views flawed political systems as emerging from a flawed global government industry. And so we believe in incentives over elections and in competing over complaining. Um, there are sort of, unfortunately, very few of these structural solutions which actually understand how bad laws come from bad incentives and try to change them. Anarcho-capitalism is one of the few, and federalism and secession movements to some degree, which would increase competition in government, and of course my own seasteading. Um, one thing that I think is fun, this is The Wire, which I'm sure many of you have seen, um, and this sort of old versus new viewpoint actually maps quite neatly onto a normal cop drama versus The Wire. So in a normal cop drama, the protagonist like puts his heart into everything he does and tries his damnedest because he cares about helping the world. He's good and his enemies are bad, selfish people. Which is, very natural and fill their hearts with passion and is also very naive and not how the world actually works. In The Wire, instead, everyone is a bit bad, a bit good, a bit selfish, and the enemy that causes bad things to happen is not like one evil person, but the system, the web of incentives that governs everyone's actions. So a classic quote from a cop drama would be like, "You killed my partner, you son of a bitch! I'm gonna get you!" And here's a classic quote from The Wire, where one cop says to the other, "This is why I think we can't win this," referring to the war on drugs. The other one says, "Why?" First one says, "When the drug dealers screw up, they get beaten. When we, the cops, screw up, we get a pension." So this is like an incentive view of things. It's not about whether drugs are bad or good or the people working on it are bad or good, but what are the incentive systems that are set up. And this is how the world actually works. And unfortunately, so folk activism, you can see on the screen here, is very intuitive and does not work. And this sort of structural incentive thinking for most people is not very intuitive, although agorists and anarcho-capitalists, I think, get it the best. And whether or not it can be effective at changing things is questionable because changing the world to work better is very hard, but it at least has a chance. It's not like burying our heads in the sand, talking to other libertarians about how much things suck, and sort of fantasizing about the day when everybody will come to agree with us, and writing papers so that we can like get feedback from our peers and not feel alone. I mean, not feeling alone is important and is a good thing, but we should also direct efforts at changing things, and those efforts should be directed in some way that might actually change things. Um, so I want freedom, not just fantasies and commiserating with other people. So I think we should try this structural stuff. All right. So that was sort of a quick overview. I'm going to scaremonger some more about how we can't get freedom by conventional methods. It'll probably be preaching to the choir to this audience, attempting to make people feel afraid, confused, and helpless. Then talk about how bad policies and governments emerge from bad incentives, which will hopefully soothe you and wondering, okay, but how do we use this? And then I will give you the answer, a note of cheerful optimism, and then I will talk about sort of frontierism versus agorism as ways of changing the future. And, disclaimers, I like to talk about how various ideas are wrong and misguided, but only because I really like these ideas and I really want freedom. I'm passionate because I care. And almost anything that I complain about that is a mistake of other people is something that I have done. So I spent lots of time trying to convince people that they should be libertarians, thinking about public office and working within the system. But even though I think it's all hopeless. So it's not like this is the pot calling the kettle black. We've all been there. We all have these instincts to persuade other people and eventually persuade everyone and accomplish our goals instead of figuring out the sort of hard counterintuitive sideways things that will actually work. So no blame, just trying to convince of a different strategy. All right, libertarian electoral victory in the U.S. Completely hopeless. Ron Paul is sort of the most promising libertarian candidate ever. He set fundraising records. It's a graph of him back in 2008, and he received 5.5% of the primary vote and less than 1% of the total delegates. So when a huge relative success compared to past libertarian-ish candidates is a sort of total failure on an absolute basis, you got a big problem. And some sort of Ron Paul fans say, okay, but we can do way better. I mean, this movement is growing. But the problem is that libertarians are a minority. There's actually studies on libertarian personality types. David Nolan, who created the Nolan chart, has surveys that show that at most 16% of people have libertarian beliefs. Studies out of Cato with more restrictive definitions have found numbers as low as 6%. And we have a tendency, I think many libertarians are very logical. Some of us even started out with very different intuitive views and came to our beliefs logically, and so we think that most people can be convinced by logic. But modern psychological research, this is Jonathan Haidt here in a TED Talk, suggests that for most people, moral beliefs are innate. They argue in order to justify the moral beliefs that they have, what their heart tells them is true, rather than deriving moral beliefs through a process of logic. And so you can't actually change most people's minds. It doesn't matter how many copies of Atlas Shrugged or Free to Choose are out there, libertarians will always be a minority. So there's got to be some way to win with a minority. But actually, it's even worse than that. It's even worse than the fact that we're a minority. Even if there were 50% libertarians, the game of democracy is rigged against us. Um, in the sort of the folk view of the world, political candidates compete in elections by crafting platforms that appeal to the values of voters. So the way to get your candidate to win is to convince a majority of people to share your values. And I'm depicting this world here in this slide as a magical realm of fairies and unicorns, where the fairies soulfully bond with the unicorns in an enchanted forest of wonder and delight. Um, but this is not how things actually work. There's this great H.L. Mencken quote: "Every election is a sort of advance auction sale of stolen goods." So in the structural view, this is literally true. The way that a political candidate gets the resources to compete in an election is that they promise political favors to special interests to get the resources they need to win the elections, to get the power to pay back those special interests. And libertarians, sort of the honest but naive libertarian, is competing on a platform of not using the power. They're like the hobbits in Lord of the Rings. Like, give me the ring and I'm just going to destroy it. Like, give me possession of the enormous machinery of waste and corruption is the state so that I can dismantle it instead of paying you back. And then they wonder why the other side always has more allies and more money. So not only are libertarians a numerical minority, but we actually underperform our numerical popularity. Um, it's hopeless. And part of the folk activism intuition is that you just need to be right, and you need to argue clearly and compellingly and often for why you're right, and everyone will believe you, and then good things will happen and the world will change. And that's not how the world works. Ron Paul's Audit the Fed bill had hundreds of co-sponsors. His Abolish the Fed bill had zero, even though the Fed is crap. We're right about the disaster of public education, but the NEA is the single largest union in the country. It has a lock on legislators and spending. Being right is hopeless. Any intelligent person who studies the war on drugs can see that it's a total failure. Still around, still destroying lives, still sucking lots of money. Being right is not enough. So there's an interesting question, right? Why do we have government that's wrong? And I like to classify political analysis into three levels of analysis. And two of these levels sort of come from public choice theory, and one is new to me. So at the top level, we have policies, sort of specific rules like regulations and taxes. And a lot of effort is wasted on attacking bad solutions here and proposing good ones, as if the reason we had bad laws was that there weren't enough good ones being suggested or argued for. This is in denial of 60 years of Nobel Prize winning economics called public choice theory, which sort of treats politicians and political systems as systems of incentives where people act in their own self-interest, and the result is lots of bad laws. I'll give one example in a minute. And this field is great for diagnosing the problems of politics, but it doesn't offer much in the way of solutions. Or when it does, it offers theoretical solutions without explaining like why we don't have them in practice. And my contribution is to add an extra level. Just as policies emerge from political systems, so do political systems emerge from the global government industry, where you imagine that countries are firms and citizens are customers, and you wonder, what are the industry characteristics, and are they good or bad for innovation? And there's a specific characteristic that I focus on, which is that this industry doesn't allow startups. That is, the barrier to entry is very high. If you have some new idea for a website or a technology product, you can do that with just a laptop. If you have some new idea about a better government system, which many of you do, anarcho-capitalism or lots of other things, there's no way to just go out and do it. There's no way to start with a few people, convince some customers, have them convince more customers, and scale up. And that makes it a dysfunctional industry. That's why we don't get new political systems tested that consistently generate more policies. So intuitively, we tend to focus on the policy level of this. But the greatest point of leverage and the actual problem is at the industry level. And this is a sort of standard supply and demand graph. And there's this mistake that many libertarians make where they assume that democracy is a system for generating good policies that just doesn't have enough economists on staff or something. Um, they don't understand that just like prices emerge from the result of human action, not human design, prices emerge from the incentives of supply and demand. You can't just fix prices. Policies also emerge from supply and demand and how they're channeled through the incentives of the political system. You can't just fix bad laws. You have to understand why bad laws consistently come about, that there's actually an underlying logic. Now there's an obvious question of like, why are our intuitions so like misguided in this area? And I tend to think that it's an evolutionary psychology kind of thing. 100,000 years ago, when we were sitting around the fire trying to figure out how to divide up the buffalo or where to look for tubers, our individual suggestions mattered. With 100 people, what you need to do to change things is to come up with a good suggestion, articulate it clearly to a coalition of people who you build up. You recruit 5 people and then 10 people, and then you bring it to the tribe and you convince them, and that's the way that you make things happen. And our cognitive bias is to assume that we have a political voice equivalent to someone in a hunter-gatherer tribe. And so we comment on nationwide events with the level of passion of somebody commenting on things happening in their own 100-person tribe, even though in a world of 10 million people in your country or 100 million people in your country, like nobody is listening. And your voice doesn't matter, and your network is not enough to make a difference. This is my explanation for blogs, by the way. Why people blog, because they assume that their voice has an impact that it just doesn't have. And there's an issue of scale here, where the larger the system, the more the rules of interaction matter in determining the outcome. The less it's about the preferences of individual people or going out and convincing a small group of people, and the more it sort of is about unintended consequences and the dynamics of complex systems and things that are much newer and much less intuitive to us. But that's the modern world, and to fix it, you have to understand it. And part of the intuitive approach is that it assumes that local victories are the beginning of a path to global victories. For example, winning local victories in towns in New Hampshire is the path to winning victories at the state level at New Hampshire, is the path to winning victories in the entire United States. And I'm very skeptical of this. I think that the smaller the scale, the more responsive the local governments are, and the better they work. That the place that's easiest to change is the place that needs change the least. Much easier to change local than federal governments. Local governments are already working much better already. So I'm deeply skeptical of the idea that you can just start with local change and scale it up. I mean, I think that you have to start with small change and scale it up. I mean, I think it's hopeless to start with big change. But you need to start with change that you have analyzed can scale up to change things at the federal level where things are actually broken. And large systems operate on a different set of rules, and you have to understand that and be actually fixing it. My favorite economist on sort of the systemic flaws in democracy is Mansur Olson. And for those who aren't, probably many of you are familiar with the reasons why small groups, special interests, dominate large ones in democracy, but it's fun to just run over it quickly to remind people, and as an example that you can use to show other people the problem. So consider a law, or more likely some little paragraph in some 2,000-page law that costs every American $1. And it benefits 100 people by $1 million each. So it costs 300 million Americans $1. Net cost to the country, $300 million. Benefits 100 special interests by $1 million each. Net benefit, $100 million. So the net cost, 300 million cost, 100 million benefit. The country loses $200 million from this paragraph of this law. This law will pass every time in a democracy. In fact, to an economist, it's like democracy is a system for passing these kinds of laws. And the reason is, there's no way that we know about some paragraph of a 1,000-page bill that costs us $1. Like, we can't know. There are a zillion of these. If you spend an hour trying to find out about this and lobby for it, you're like taking a shot at earning $1 an hour, even if what you do makes the difference. If what you do doesn't make the difference, you've earned $0 an hour. Whereas these 100 people who benefit $1 million each, you know that they're going to know about this paragraph. They probably wrote it. They're going to be actively out there, happy to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying for it. Another way to look at this, if you think about public goods and private goods, is that this law, to these 100 people who benefit by $1,000,000, the law is much closer to a private good. Each person gets 1% of the benefit. If they can organize 100 people into a group, that group is getting all the benefit. For the rest of us, this law is a public good. We each get 1/300 millionth the cost. In order to get the 1% of the benefit that each of these special interests have, we would need to organize 3 million people. So the cost of organizing that group would wipe out the benefit. It's just basic economics that private goods beat out public goods. And in a democracy, bad law is a private good law is a public good, and so we get more bad laws than good laws. And another fascinating sort of Austrian aspect to this is the way that it progresses over time, right? That it's not like neoclassical economics where there's some sort of static thing, but that over time, democracies accumulate special interests. That the longer an industry has been around, the more its special interests capture the regulators. I mean, just look at the difference between the dot-com bust and the financial crisis. We didn't get massive bailouts of dot-com companies because they were new. They hadn't had decades like Wall Street had decades to capture Washington, D.C. In the financial bailout, I mean, maybe there was a slightly better narrative about how it mattered more to the country, but really it was sort of the Goldman Sachs Treasury connection, that this was an older industry. I mean, look at car companies. I mean, the argument for bailing out car companies is just as bad as the argument for bailing out internet companies, but the car companies got bailouts because they are old. And old industries have captured more regulators, have prevented innovation, or able to direct public funds to themselves. And this sort of effect over time is something that classic economics really misses. And it relates to this kind of historical rise and fall of civilizations. It's actually, I've been talking about democracy, but it's bigger than democracy. The pattern where systems began directed for a certain purpose and change over time to perpetuate themselves at the expense of the masses has been around for thousands of years. And it's a lot of what causes civilization to fall as these things accumulate. And I think we need to fix it. And I find it kind of nuts that we have these, 60 years of Nobel Prize winning economics that gets almost completely ignored in activism. And I bet that the Agorist community finds this nuts too, because Agorism actually takes into account some of these questions of how can we have a strategy for change that actually works step by step. But most libertarians basically ignore the entire field of public choice in their activism. Like literally you have public choice professors who try to change the world by writing letters to the editor, where an oversimplification of public choice theory, but with some truth, is that public choice theory is the theory of why writing letters to the editor will not fix anything. And so when public choice professors write letters to the editors, their activism, that is the world gone mad, as far as I can tell. It's as if engineers try to design airplanes without using aerodynamics. It's nuts. We actually have these theories of why government doesn't work, and the people trying to fix government completely ignore them. It's just completely fucking nuts. And I think more of us need to be out there, saying that this is nuts. Because it's not arguing about, what's right and wrong, what should you believe as far as what kind of society you want to live in. All it is saying, if you want to accomplish X, you should use the modern science of X in figuring out how to do it. So I think it's a message that could sell, especially to libertarians. And we should be out there saying just how ridiculous it is that most activists just completely ignore economics and incentives. It ignores the entire field of law and economics too. I mean, you can give an entire talk on the fact that there's no simple mapping from goals for a society to laws and institutions which will achieve those goals, that even if me and these 73 viewers completely agreed on our definition of rights, there is no simple way to turn that into a society. Determining what penalties to impose for each right violation, how to judge and enforce the laws, that's actually the hard part of the problem. Good government is basically a technology. And like every technology, it comes from experimentation, feedback, trial and error, and market incentives. It does not come from, it does not spring full formed like Athena from the brow of Zeus, or like John Galt from the brow of Rand. Um, another time that this madness expresses itself is in people who wish to restore the American Constitution. Complete madness, right? Of all the possible political systems that seek to accomplish a free and prosperous society, how many of them have been tested and failed to achieve that goal? Almost none, because almost none of them have been tried. But one of the few political systems that has been tested and failed to maintain freedom is the United States Constitution of 1787. Why? Why in the world would you restore the system that was tried and failed? It's nuts. Why wouldn't you, for example, look at the past 200 plus years of history and all of the latest insights of science and economics and psychology and try to figure out what went wrong and craft a new political system that's your best shot at actually working? Like, that is what people who are pragmatically trying to solve a problem would do. This sort of restore the Constitution, and the problem is that people just didn't have enough willpower. They just didn't stick to it. It's sort of intuitive. It's kind of like the diet approach of like, you just need to try harder to lose weight. But it's nuts, right? You lose weight by finding ways to do it without trying harder. That's how you actually lose weight. And you actually get government that restores freedom by figuring out systems that work regardless of what people believe, not by trying to convince people they've lost their way. That was a bit of a rant, but I'm passionate about this subject. So how can we actually change things? We can actually change things by being sort of entrepreneurs, by looking at government as an industry where the countries are firms, the citizens are customers, and the product is the laws and institutions. And this industry is awfully bad. It has very little innovation and very little customer focus. I've never heard, for example, of Starbucks murdering its customers. And this is not an accident. There are properties of the coffee industry, like that it's very easy for anyone to exit, to stop going to Starbucks and start going to Pete's or their local coffee chain, and that it's very easy for anyone to enter. It's very easy for anybody to start a new coffee chain. And that leads to good customer service. It's not because the people who run Starbucks have a better idea of freedom. It's just that they choose to offer good services to compete for their customers. So this barrier to entry is very important, that we can start a new web business with a laptop. But in order to start a new country, we need to win a war, an election, or revolution. Try doing that on the side in your nights and weekends. Every piece of land on earth is claimed, and countries will very happily use violence against anything they see as threatening that local monopoly that they have. A great example of an industry with these characteristics is operating systems. So there's a high barrier to entry because you have to not only make the OS, you have to get all these applications. There's a high cost of switching, and so there's very few operating systems. It's not because operating systems aren't important or there's not a lot of theoretical different ones that you can write. I mean, I have friends who write operating systems for fun, but the industry has these characteristics. And a lot of people blame Microsoft, the same way we blame people for not believing in freedom enough. But Microsoft makes a great product in the Xbox because it was a competitive industry. They're coming into this new industry where people get new gaming consoles every couple of years, so the cost of switching is not that bad, and they had to make a good product in order to make money, whereas Windows did not have to be good to make money. So same people, different incentives, different results. So within this framework, the answer is clearly to have more competition with government. That's the agorist answer also. I'm skeptical about competing on existing ground where countries are, but at least it is competition. It's not this kind of hopeless, let's complain and hope that things change. So I'm going to explain seasteading because I understand it the best, and I'd love to have a dialogue after. Maybe this will be 10 more minutes of me talking. I'd love to have a dialogue about compare and contrast. Seasteading, agorism, and other various routes to increase competition. One problem is, why convince the masses? And this is something that I worry about with agorism as well as democracy. In democracy, you have to persuade 50% of the people that you're right just to try the system. And even if you're building up a counter economy in the world, you have to convince a lot of people to build that counter economy, to use that counter economy in order for it to take over. I would rather take 100 people and go off and create a new society in a blank place where nobody is committed to defending that blank place. Nobody sees it as their territory. I mean, how many millions of words of papers and books does it take to add up to the two words Hong Kong in defending freedom and capitalism? Examples are very powerful. And political startups have historically happened on the frontier, right? America got started with a group of people who gave up on fighting the powers at home, ran away to the frontier, tried out a radical new system, and it worked so well that it served as an example that changed the places that they left. Everyone else was losing citizens to this new startup. Over 1 million people a year at one point in the late 1800s were moving to America. So they saw it was better, they were getting outcompeted, and so they changed in its directions. This is how competition works in industries. Startups provide tests of new options and the threat of competition to the established countries. And so it's startups that we need to improve things. And the next frontier is the oceans. So this is a picture of seasteading, which means homesteading the high seas, building new nation states on the ocean. It's sort of the modern equivalent of Europeans heading to America or Americans heading west. You know, this is what I work on full time is the actual practice of making floating cities real. I could do a whole presentation of this. When we get to the chat phase, I'll paste in a video of a talk on the strategy of how we're actually doing this. But for you guys, I'm going to focus on the theory of this as a method of activism. So seasteading dramatically lowers the barrier to entry. We think we can build the first one for low tens of millions of dollars, maybe worst case hundreds of millions of dollars, which is way easier than winning a war, an election, or revolution. And the other cool thing is that the ocean is not just the next unclaimed space. It actually is a fundamentally different physical medium that makes it better for building a free society. So this is a picture of a cruise ship and the Empire State Building on the same scale. So it's literally true that objects as large as skyscrapers move around the oceans on a daily basis. That we can build cities on the ocean out of modular, rearrangeable units where you could change countries without leaving your house. In the same way that right now when a multinational corporation is choosing where to put its factory, it shops around to different countries and tries to get the best deal. And a few people who are expatriating shop around to different countries and try to get the best deal. On the ocean, you can actually have the physical land that you create shop around for different jurisdictions to get the best deal, where capital, physical capital in the shape of land and buildings, moves to its highest value legal jurisdiction. It's almost a physical analog of the flexibility and competition of anarcho-capitalism. It's not as good in that there's higher switching costs to move a building around, even on the ocean, than to change law providers. On the other hand, we have a lot of historical evidence that local geographic monopolies on legislation and the use of violence seem to be stable, and while I certainly hope that competitive markets in law can be made stable, and I'd love to try them, it's less clear that they actually will be stable. There may be forces which make provision of law a natural monopoly. And in this case, the ocean gives us a way to have this competition even with local geographic monopolies, because we can move people and buildings in between the different local geographic monopolies more cheaply than on land. And what I believe is that this moving to the oceans will get us something more like the web industry and less like current politics, with many small startup governments innovating, competing, and experimenting to see what best serves citizens. The governments that have the best product will grow, will gather people, will gather physical capital, and those that don't will die like they deserve. And I'd just like to briefly point out how powerfully different a view of government this consumer focus and industry focus is than if you think about government as right and wrong and morality. If you think, I want certain rules and I want certain freedoms, and I'm going to shop around to try to get it, or I'm going to create a new set of rules and institutions to try to get it, that is a really practical, results-oriented, an empowered way to look at the world, when you say, God damn it, every fucking country has these horrible, immoral rules. It's very natural to think this way, and it has people who are exploiting us, and most people are just fucking blind, and they don't get it. And it's just awful. I hate living in a country that has these laws that just seem so immoral to me. That is frustrating. It is disempowering, and it's the intuitive way to think about government, and it's the old way. And I'd really encourage everyone, as much as you can, to shift to thinking of government as a product that is being delivered badly, and your life kind of suffers because of this bad product, and to look for ways that you could make the product better or work around the bad product, as opposed to seeing it as like a great moral fight against good and evil. Because I think that this way of viewing things is both makes you happier in your life and leads towards much more likely ways of fixing things. Even though I believe deep in my heart in the moral view as well. I think that it really profoundly does not serve us. All right. And this viewpoint shows us the weakness of trying to win the war of ideas or get big numbers of people. That's appealing and noble, but it's ultimately ineffective. Without competition, without startups, we will not get innovative government that serves niche markets like libertarianism. We will get bad government generating bad policies that benefit the political class. So we do not need more academic papers. We do not need mind share. We need more people working to create competition in government, which is what agorism is doing, even though I have some doubts about the strategy, which is what seasteading is doing, which is what the Free State Project is doing, even though I have doubts about the strategy. It's what Charter Cities is doing. It's what, a small number of people, especially younger people, especially tech-focused, especially narco-capitalists, are actually doing. And that's awesome. And I encourage all of you who get this new way of thinking to be out there convincing the libertarians who can get it that they need to switch. Because there's actually plenty of us and plenty of I mean, with the budget of the Cato Institute in the past 3 years, I promise you that if I had that budget for 5 years, there would be free floating cities in the ocean. Like, we have the resources. We're just not applying them in a smart way. That this idea that most libertarians have been doing things all wrong, you might think that that's like depressing, that it's like wasted resources. But that's past looking. If you instead go forward looking, it's incredibly optimistic. It means that if we work smarter instead of harder, instead of with more people, we might actually be able to change things and get real freedom in the next decade or two. So I find that incredibly inspiring, and that's what I work on all day long, every day, because I think it can actually work. Incentives. They work even if you don't believe them. So if we create an example of a free system with good incentives, we can then bring like tens of millions of people from the third world into working free systems, and they will have freedom, and we will still have freedom. Whether or not those people get anarcho-capitalism, for example. If we create the system and then bring them in, and that's what got them rich and got them free of the grinding poverty of Africa, they will believe in the system. And a metaphor that I like for libertarians, just to expose the incredible cognitive dissonance between their beliefs, their stated beliefs, and their actions, is to say, like, we're not talking about government. Let's just suppose there's some industry and it has a bad product. Let's think of two things we could do. One is, and it has a bad product because it's a monopoly. Maybe it's AT&T before the breakup, Windows before Apple got big, whatever. One thing we could do is we could complain to the monopoly. We could picket its headquarters. We could write letters. We could fill out those little customer survey cards that they have in their offices, and try to convince the monopoly and try to convince others that this monopoly is offering bad products. Or we could figure out how to allow other firms to enter the market and compete with this monopoly. It's completely obvious that the second way is better. The second way is the way that economics dictates. So why is it that the people who claim to love markets and competition try the first way? I mean, it's mad. It's complete madness and cognitive dissonance. Just blows my mind. All right. Almost done the seasteading competitive government rant. I'm just going to give a brief family note, and then talk a little bit about agorism, and then open it up to questions soon. So I find it fun to cite that I have this family history of libertarianism that actually maps directly onto these three levels of analysis. So my grandfather, Milton Friedman, was all about advocating for better policies in a clear way to try to reach millions of people and persuade them. And he persuaded some people of better policies. But it does not seem to have changed the overall trajectory of government. And when he formed his views on activism, was before public choice theory. So then my dad, David Friedman, comes along after public choice theory, and having seen sort of the failure of rhetoric to change things, and he becomes an anarcho-capitalist and is one of the leading proponents of anarcho-capitalism, which says, let's not change the laws, let's find a political system where there are strong economic arguments that say that this political system would generate consistently better laws than we currently have. And there are great economic arguments that anarcho-capitalism would do this. So then I come along a generation later and say, okay, I'm convinced anarcho-capitalism is the most plausible system that I have heard yet to get a better government. Why hasn't it happened? There are tens of thousands of people around the world who believe this. Why don't we have it? And dig a level deeper and say, okay, the problem is not that there aren't good ideas for political systems, just as the problem was not that there weren't good ideas for laws. The problem is we have no way to test these ideas in practice at a small scale and have the best ideas for new political systems scale up and compete and take over. That is the fundamental problem. And that we don't need to sit around inventing better laws. We don't need to figure out the better commodities-backed money. We don't need to figure out even better political systems. We don't need to figure out the best way to make ANCAP work. What we need to do is to enable startup countries. And then the market will provide lots of ideas and lots of startup countries, and the best ones will work, and we know that government will get better at serving customers when it has a startup sector, when it has the virtues of competition. We don't actually have to figure out exactly why or how. That is the virtues of the market. And I claim that, this is whether or not it's Seasteading that provides this competition, whatever. Maybe it's charter cities. Maybe it's secession. Maybe it's the counter economy. But that this is the only true way of improving government that is compatible with market-oriented thinking and understanding how the world actually works and how incentive works. And that trying to change things at any other level is actually sort of denying all of the things that those who believe in economics and free market economics and libertarianism claim to believe. All right, so I will very quickly make my sort of frontierism versus agorism comments and then open it up to your questions. So I'm going to define agorism here as creating a counter-economy in existing countries side by side with existing political systems. And my arguments only apply in as much as that is accurate. And I think that there are some real difficulties with this strategy as opposed to going to a frontier like the oceans or space and starting, or even to some degree cyberspace, and starting new political systems in empty places. So one big problem with existing alongside current countries is the emotional response of people feeling like you are trying to displace the existing system. And this is really powerful. The funny example that I give is that I call it the Avatar effect. For those of you who have seen Avatar, we had people whose land was being taken by a corporation with vastly more resources than them, vastly higher technology. It was like this tribe with dinosaurs against like military helicopters and bombs. But these people, these guys with their bows and arrows and dinosaurs, were like so fired up and so angry that people were taking their land that they beat the helicopters and the gunships. People get really, really mad in a deeply primal way if they feel that foreigners or people with foreign ideas are trying to displace them. And there was a real example of this a year or two ago in Madagascar, where Paul Romer was trying to establish a charter city. That is, a zone on empty land with different economic rules and different political rules, where he's going to bring in a large electronics company that was going to open factories and plants on this empty land. From a rational standpoint, this was a pure win for the people of Madagascar. The land was being unused. This would bring in foreign direct investment and provide jobs. And they rioted and kicked out the president over it because they saw it as foreigners taking their land, even though it was empty. So, you know, there's a big difference. If you know somebody who like has a lot of guns and terrorizes all those around them, I'm talking about the state, of course, has a lot of guns, terrorizes those around them. There's a big difference between going and shitting on their front yard and shitting in the woods 50 miles away, and the emotional reaction that you'll get from them. You go and shit in their front yard, you are just asking for them to pull out every weapon at their disposal and do everything they can do to crack down on you. If you shit in the woods 50 miles away, they've got local things to worry about. It's not so real. It's not so in their face. And the emotional impact is much lower. And if it's outside their claimed territory, you're not taking something that they said was theirs. They don't need to signal that they follow through on their commitments and maintain the things that they said. So that's one reason why I think it's much better to go to an empty place. Then there's a number of people that required, as I alluded to, and I'd like to open this to questions soon. So I'm just going to give what I think is the other most important point, and that's the difference between doing things transparently and legally, as if you find loopholes in international law to be able to go in international waters and start new businesses, versus a counter economy that is doing things that are technically illegal and need to be hidden, and if they were out in the open, would be cracked down on by the authorities. There's a certain romance to doing things that are illegal, and it certainly is a great way to work around bad laws, but it's hard to scale it up, because the bigger something gets, the harder it is to hide it. It's hard to get allies, especially allies with a lot of resources. People who have made hundreds of millions of dollars generally are conservative. They want to work out in the open. They don't want to support things that are illegal in the current system. It's hard to get allies. It's hard to get allies with families. It's hard to get allies who are worried about being locked up in jail. It's hard to get capital. It's hard to get banks to invest in you because you're operating in this gray area, in this sort of gray/black area. And even if the rules are bad, there are a lot of things about operating in gray and black markets that, it filters for people who think about ideas for themselves. It filters people who come up with the rules that are right and not just what they're told. It also filters people who are willing to tolerate a lot of risk, who have short time horizons. If you look at the drug industry, for example, it filters for people who are willing to use violence themselves directly in order to enforce their contracts. People who are more comfortable with violence, who are more comfortable with hiding, who are more comfortable with doing things that society does not approve of. I'm very contrarian, but I'm also very authentic. I hate hiding. And I don't want to do small things. I want to do big things. I want to do things that I can get banks to invest $1 billion in a free society. I want to get $1 billion invested in an anarcho-capitalist protection agency. I want to get allies who are top entrepreneurs from around the world to help me, who have succeeded in giant open companies, to help me in founding anarcho-capitalist protection agencies. And I can only do this by going not to the counter economy, not to the gray or black market, but by using legal loopholes to do something openly, in public, that is legal according to current laws because it's in an empty place. And I would, I think that many people in the counter economy are good people. I support breaking bad laws, but as a strategy to change the world, I think it's deeply flawed. To change the world, you want to be able to get access to capital, access to great people who have won even within the system, great entrepreneurs who have created great companies. And to do that, you need to find a strategy, I believe, that can be done legally and transparently. And there are probably variations on agorism that can be done legally and transparently, where you try to create a new currency that uses legal loopholes to be legal. And I definitely support those. But I personally think that it is not a winning strategy to try to build up an illegal economy and believe that that will somehow take over, that it'll be able to resist the brutal repression, that it'll be able to get support from great people. So that is my talk. Um, Seasteading.org, 1000nations.com. Seasteading.org, you can learn a lot more about the practicalities of this. 1000 Nations about the political theory. Um, and I'm going to switch to chat now and take some questions. Okay, we'll try to be very quick. Um, what about tsunamis and hurricanes? Tsunamis do not exist on the deep ocean. They're just little swells that seasteads will rise with. Hurricanes are a big problem. The greatest costs of seasteading are engineering large structures to withstand the worst wave and the worst hurricane that you ever get. But it's doable. It's doable actually at construction costs that are basically like first world big city. It's cheaper than Manhattan or San Francisco, more like where I live in Silicon Valley, a few $100s a square foot. Zoning laws and permitting laws actually drive up land costs almost as much as having to deal with waves. Um, so that's handleable. Um, yeah, I'm also Keith mentions the eventual collapse of the federal government. I'm deeply skeptical, by the way, that the federal government will collapse. I mean, I think that it's going to financially collapse, that we'll see a sovereign default in the next 10 or 20 years. Um, but I think that people with power and a monopoly on violence are very good at maintaining it, and that it is deeply naive to think that they will just collapse. We do not see a history of power collapsing. We see a history of power altering to deal with new trends. All right, I want to address several of these questions. Yes, we need engineers. I want to address several of these questions with what we call the cruise ship challenge and the cruise ship criterion. And the cruise ship criterion is that any anything that is being done today on hundreds of cruise ships around the world um, is not a problem that we need to worry about. So power, electricity, water, importing food, finding staff to work at your hotel in the middle of nowhere, that these are not actually problems that we need to solve because they're being solved by cruise ships. Um, Don Pomeroy says, our own research papers indicate there's no body of water the U.S. government would not be willing to claim as their jurisdiction or claim that they have a right to intervene in. That it depends what for. So there's a there's a um, there's a tendency of libertarians um, to think that the governments will kind of interfere anywhere for anything, and that they will correctly evaluate seasteads as competition. But that's not really true. If you look historically, there's a limited set of things that the governments will interfere for, and I would say that the U.S. government will interfere anywhere in the world if you are harboring terrorists, laundering money, working on weapons of mass destruction, or exporting drugs to the United States. That's what the history says. The U.S. Navy will go thousands of miles to do that. But the U.S. government does not interfere in other places, in other countries, for almost everything else. I mean, including horrible things like slavery and child sex trafficking. There's all kinds of things that the U.S. does not interfere with because it does not see those things as affecting their own local sovereignty. So as long as seasteads avoid doing those few things, I don't think that countries are going to interfere with us. Another thing is we are opening dialogues with small countries right now about having treaties with them that let us plug into international law. So there's a sort of libertarian tendency like, let's say fuck you to all the countries because they are evil, the evil statists who are oppressing people, and we're just going to go do our own thing. And I'm very emotionally sympathetic to that viewpoint, but practically, countries are much, much worse if they feel that they're being, it's just like a cop. If you give the finger to a cop, you're about to be face down on the pavement. If you say to a cop, good evening, sir, what's going on? What can I do to help you? That you still might end up face down on the pavement, but it's much less likely. So we want to be open with countries, talk to them about what things will really bother them, and not do those things, because that's practical. All right, how many people can live? There is no upper limit. There's technology that can make these things close to as cheap as land, and you can have millions of people on these. The government will interfere with potential competitors. Maybe. I mean, I haven't seen the U.S. invade Singapore, and Singapore is effectively competing with the U.S. If you look at the EU response to low corporate tax rates in Ireland, which is essentially undercutting the attempted tax cartel of tax harmonization, they've done something. They just said that they would not restructure the Irish debt, the other EU banks, because they didn't like the low tax rates in Ireland. But they haven't said we're going to invade you over your low tax rates. I mean, if you actually look at what governments actually do in the real world, they don't invade over competition. They just don't. Um, Americans leave with their money. Hundreds of Americans leave with their own money every year. There is a tax called the expatriation tax, where you have to pay a one-time tax on your assets, on all of the unrealized gains as if you liquidated them, and then you're free. And that's the law. And I know people who have done this. Um, and, it sucks. I mean, I don't think that's moral, but you can't escape. Um, Robert Phillips would rather never have freedom than get a certain limited amount of freedom. Um, I'm practical. If you're not motivated by having way more local independence than we have now, as long as you don't export drugs, research weapons of mass destruction, harbor terrorists, or have anonymous banking, but you can do everything else. You can use drugs locally. You can have prostitution locally. You can have very low barriers to entry to entrepreneurs. You can have the rights to your own genome. You can have different regions with different copyright laws and patent laws. You can get 98% of the grab bag of rights that we want if you are just willing to not insist on all of them. So if that's not good enough for you, okay. Personally, I'd rather take the practical people and go get as much freedom as we practically can. Ken asked if it's realistically expect the first test seastead, 5 years for a converted ship, 10 years for like a village in one place. The ships will move around. The sort of we can plug into international law the most easily by being classified as a ship, using the sovereignty of another country. Moving around, you only have to be 12 miles out. Eventually, when you're a large fixed structure, you have to be 200 miles out. There's actually something very interesting here about international law, which you guys probably don't realize, is that maritime law is actually like it's almost an anarchic system. That maritime law is a competitive market for franchising sovereignty. Nobody before me realized this. I mean, it wasn't designed to be. But maritime law says every ship flies the flag of a country, and you have to obey the laws of that country, in theory, if they enforce them, but it's a virtual association. Any ship can fly the flag of any country. And so it's a competitive market where the oversight of those countries on the ships is driven almost to zero because it's a competitive market for them franchising their sovereignty. And so we can get way more rights, way more concessions from existing countries with a flagging agreement than we can get on any one piece of land where there's a monopoly. So it's actually an awesome legal loophole to exploit. All right, looks like we're out of time. I'm going to post the slides somewhere and also post some more practical talks on the nuts and bolts of how we're making this happen. I thought you guys would be more interested in theory. And George says there is some place. Take the conversation to the lobby on the front page of the website. I've got to leave soon, but I'll stay for another 5 or 10 minutes of chat on the front page of the website. Can you post a link? Someone post a link to that here, please. Glad you guys liked it. And I will log off now, but stay in chat. Thanks for listening.